What if I told you that the borders of nations, the rise of kings, and the very laws that governed ancient civilizations weren't decided in grand halls or on battlefields, but in hushed ceremonies under the stars? Picture this, a world where the fate of empires hinged on rituals so obscure, so deeply shrouded in mystery, that even today, their full meaning eludes us. These weren't just empty traditions, they were the invisible threads weaving together the fabric of societies, guiding everything from when to plant crops to who would wear the crown. And here's the astonishing part: these rituals didn't just fade into history. Their echoes still ripple through our world, hidden in plain sight. Think about the last time you felt the pull of a full moon or the quiet power of a shared tradition. That sensation, it's a faint whisper of the same forces that once dictated the rhythms of entire nations. Ancient leaders didn't just rule by force or charisma. They understood something profound, that rituals, those carefully choreographed acts of symbolism, could unite people, bend the natural world to their will, and even alter the course of history. Some rituals were tied to the heavens, aligning with celestial events to predict the best time for harvest or war. Others were so secret, so tightly guarded, that only a chosen few ever learned their true purpose. And yet, these enigmatic practices shaped laws, settled disputes, and decided the winners and losers of wars long forgotten. So how did it all work? Why would something as seemingly simple as a dance, a chant, or a ceremony under the open sky hold such sway over the destiny of nations? That's the mystery we're unraveling today. We're diving deep into the shadows of history to uncover how these rituals were more than just tradition. They were the hidden architecture of power. From the initiation rites that transformed ordinary citizens into leaders, to the celestial rituals that dictated when armies would march, we'll explore how these ancient practices didn't just reflect society, they built it. And by the end, you'll start to see the traces they left behind, hidden in the rituals we still follow, even if we've long forgotten why. This isn't just a journey into the past. It's a key to understanding the invisible forces that shaped and still shape our world. Consider the throne of Egypt not just a seat of power, but a conduit for the gods. When a new pharaoh took the crown, the ceremony wasn't merely symbolic. Every gesture, every chant, every offering was meticulously designed to weave the ruler into the cosmic order. The Hebb festival, held after 30 years of a pharaoh's reign, wasn't just a celebration, it was a rebirth. The ruler would run a ritual race, proving their physical and divine vitality, while priests reenacted the myth of Osiris, tying the king's fate to the cycle of death and resurrection. Fail this test and the kingdom could crumble under the weight of doubt. Now cross the sands to Mesopotamia, where kingship wasn't inherited. It was earned through ritual ordeal. A ruler would descend into the depths of a ziggurat, stripped of his regalia, to face a night of trials meant to mirror the journey of the underworld. If he emerged at dawn, he wasn't just a man, he was a living bridge between heaven and earth, his authority unquestionable. These rituals weren't theater. They were the operating system of ancient governance, a way to translate the chaos of human ambition into something the people could see, touch, and believe in. But here's what's even more fascinating. These rites didn't just validate rulers, they constrained them. A Mesopotamian king who ignored the sacred calendar, who waged war out of season or neglected the rites of renewal, risked more than rebellion. He risked breaking the covenant with the gods themselves. Rituals turned power into a sacred contract, one that even the mightiest ruler couldn't violate without consequence. And it wasn't just about kings. In the Indus Valley, entire cities would align their layouts to celestial events, turning streets into ritual pathways for processions that reinforced social order. In ancient China, the mandate of heaven wasn't just a philosophical idea. It was enacted through elaborate ceremonies where the emperor alone would offer sacrifices to the sky. The message was clear: rule wasn't just about force, it was about maintaining harmony between earth and heaven, and the rituals were the proof. So why does this matter to us today? Because these ancient rites reveal a truth we've forgotten. Power doesn't endure on strength alone. It endures because people believe in the story behind it. The crowns, the anthems, the oaths of office, they're all echoes of those same sacred scripts, rewritten for a modern world. The next time you see a leader take an oath with their hand on a holy book, remember, you're witnessing the ghost of a ritual that once decided the fate of empires. Imagine a world where the difference between feast and famine wasn't just about rain or soil, but about the precise timing of a dance, the correct arrangement of offerings, or the whispered words of a priestess. For ancient civilizations, survival wasn't left to chance. It was choreographed. Take the Thesmophoria in ancient Greece, where women gathered in secrecy, fasting and burying piglets in pits dedicated to Demeter, the goddess of grain. This wasn't just superstition. It was a calculated act of reciprocity, a way to ensure the earth would wake from its winter slumber and reward their labor with abundance. The ritual's power lay in its unshakable logic. If you honored the forces that governed growth, they would honor you in return. Half a world away, the Emperor of China would step into a field each spring, his royal hands gripping a plow to carve the first furrow of the season. This wasn't just ceremony, it was cosmology in action, a belief that human effort, when perfectly synchronized with the rhythms of heaven and earth, could coax life from the soil. The emperor's ritual plowing was more than symbolic, it was a contractual obligation. If he neglected it, the consequences were dire. Chronicles from the Han Dynasty record droughts and crop failures blamed not on shifting weather patterns, but on a ruler's failure to perform the rites with enough reverence. But here's what's truly remarkable. These rituals weren't just pleas to the divine. They were early systems of risk management. In Mesopotamia, the Akitu festival marked the new year with 12 days of processions, prayers, and the ritual humiliation of the king, who would kneel before the statue of Marduk, stripped of his crown, to reaffirm his submission to the gods. Only then could the annual flood cycle be trusted to nourish the fields. The message was clear: nature's cooperation wasn't guaranteed. It had to be negotiated year after year, through acts of devotion so precise that a single misstep could unravel the delicate balance. And when disaster struck, rituals became the explanation and the solution. The Hittites of Anatolia didn't see drought as bad luck. They saw it as a cosmic accounting error, a sign that someone, somewhere, had violated a sacred rule. Their response, a month-long festival of atonement, where every citizen participated in purifying rites, from the washing of statues to the recitation of ancient hymns. The goal wasn't just spiritual, it was psychological. By giving people a script to follow in times of crisis, these rituals transformed helplessness into agency. If crops failed, it wasn't because the world was chaotic. It was because the rituals hadn't been performed well enough, and that was a problem with a solution. This symbiosis of faith and food shaped more than just harvests. It built economies. In Egypt, the annual flooding of the Nile wasn't just tracked by astronomers. It was anticipated by priests who performed the Night of the Drop, a ceremony to coax the river's life-giving surge. Tax rates, labor quotas, even the price of grain were all calculated based on these predictions. Get the ritual wrong, and the entire economic system could stagger. The irony, these practices often worked, not because they magically controlled nature, but because they synchronized human activity with its patterns. By tying planting, harvesting, and even trade to ritual calendars, ancient societies created a framework that turned uncertainty into order. So the next time you pass a farmer's market or bite into a loaf of bread, remember, you're tasting the legacy of these ancient agreements between earth and effort. The rituals may have faded, but their logic lingers. We no longer bury piglets to secure a harvest, but we still rely on unseen systems, commodity markets, weather satellites, supply chains to keep our tables full. The stakes are just as high. The only difference is who or what we trust to hold up their end of the bargain. Blood oaths weren't just promises. They were psychological firewalls, burning away doubt and welding loyalty into the very bones of warriors. Picture a Germanic chieftain passing a ceremonial horn filled with mead darkened by drops of his own blood. As each warrior drank, they weren't just swallowing a beverage. They were ingesting a covenant, one that twisted fate and biology together. To break such an oath wasn't just dishonorable. It was a betrayal of the body itself, as if the blood they'd shared would turn to poison in their veins. This wasn't mere symbolism. It was a calculated act of neuroscience before the word existed. Shared pain, or in this case, shared blood, triggers a primal bonding mechanism, one that forges alliances stronger than steel. Now shift east to the samurai, where loyalty wasn't just sworn, it was carved into flesh. Sepuku, the ritual suicide performed to atone for failure, wasn't just about personal honor. It was a cultural keystone, a brutal reminder that a warrior's worth wasn't measured in victories, but in their willingness to pay the ultimate price. The act itself was a spectacle, a slow, agonizing cut across the abdomen, often witnessed by peers, with a trusted comrade standing by to deliver the merciful final blow. Why endure such horror? Because a society that elevates honor above survival doesn't need prisons or contracts. The fear of shame becomes the ultimate law enforcement. But here's the twist: these rituals weren't just about control, they were about trust. In a world without paperwork or courts, how could a leader be sure their warriors wouldn't flee when the battle turned dire? The answer lay in transforming loyalty from a choice into an identity. Viking berserkers didn't just fight with frenzy, they entered battle in a trance-like state, howling like wolves, having spent nights in rituals that blurred the line between man and myth. By the time they raised their axes, they weren't just soldiers. They were archetypes, embodying legends so potent that even the idea of cowardice became unthinkable. The genius of these rituals lay in their duality. They were both sword and shield tools to unite warriors while terrifying enemies. When Mongol hordes learned of the samurai's willingness to die rather than surrender, entire campaigns were reshaped by the sheer psychological weight of that resolve. Similarly, Celtic tribes would paint their bodies in eerie blue woad and chant before battle, not just to rally their own, but to seed dread in opponents who saw not men, but something otherworldly. The ritual became warfare itself, yet beneath the spectacle there was a deeper calculus. Societies that mastered these rites didn't just create loyal soldiers, they built cultures where the group's survival outweighed the individual's. A Spartan mother handing her son his shield with the words, "Return with it or on it," wasn't just being cruel. She was reinforcing a system where the collective was sacred. And that's why these extreme traditions endured. They didn't just bind people to oaths, they rewired what it meant to be human. Today, we see faint echoes of this in military initiations, fraternal bonds, even in the way teams or fandoms create shared identity through trials and traditions. The blood might be gone, but the instinct remains, to belong to something so deeply that its survival feels as vital as your own. That's the real power of these ancient rites. They didn't just command loyalty, they made it inseparable from the self. The heavens didn't just watch over ancient cities, they helped build them. When Mayan architects laid the first stones of Tikal, they didn't consult surveyors or engineers alone. They waited for Venus, the great star, to rise in a precise alignment, marking the spot where their pyramids would channel the planet's fierce energy into the realm of kings and warriors. This wasn't poetic metaphor, it was urban planning as cosmic contract. Every staircase, every corridor, even the placement of ball courts followed celestial maps, turning entire cities into stone calendars tracking the gods' movements. Rome took a different but equally deliberate approach. Before a single foundation was dug, priests would harness white oxen to a bronze plow, carving a sacred furrow called the pomerium, the city's divine boundary. Lift the plow at gate locations, and you had portals where gods and mortals could mingle. Cross that line with ill intent, and legend warned the heavens would withdraw their protection. The ritual wasn't superstition, it was civic engineering with spiritual stakes. When the Tiber flooded or fires ravaged districts, the blame often fell not on poor infrastructure, but on a forgotten rite or a temple built half a degree off alignment. And then there's the haunting case of Angkor Wat. Its towering spires weren't just decorative, they were precise replicas of the Hindu cosmos, with moats mirroring celestial oceans and walkways mapping the path of the sun. For centuries, this symmetry seemed unbreakable until it wasn't. Tree roots and erosion played their part, but some scholars point to a darker clue: inscriptions telling of a king who altered the sacred measurements to glorify his own reign. Shortly after, the monsoon patterns shifted, crops failed, the empire's heartbeat stuttered. Coincidence, perhaps, but to the people who'd trusted the stars as co-architects, the message was clear: you don't rewrite the sky's blueprint without consequences. Even street grids hid celestial secrets. In China's ancient capitals, avenues ran straight as arrows, not for efficiency, but to align with the North Star, the Emperor's celestial anchor. In Teotihuacan, the Avenue of the Dead doesn't point true north, but to the spot where the Pleiades set on the horizon, marking the start of the agricultural cycle. These weren't artistic flourishes, they were survival strategies in stone, ensuring that every sunrise, every market day, every royal procession reinforced humanity's pact with the cosmos. So what happens when a civilization forgets its celestial playbook? Look to the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro. Once, its streets formed perfect right angles, its drainage systems unmatched. Then, over centuries, new builders shrugged off the old astrological codes. The angles grew sloppy, the alignments wavered, and when the Indus River changed course, the city had no ritual framework to adapt. No one blamed the engineers, they blamed the broken covenant with the stars. Today, we chart our cities with satellites, not solstices, but the old logic lingers. From Washington, D.C., as Masonic alignments to the Feng Shui curves of Singapore's skyscrapers, we still whisper to the heavens, just in a language we no longer fully remember. The difference: ancient builders knew the stars weren't just guides, they were silent partners demanding their share of the blueprint. Ignore them, and even the mightiest walls might forget how to stand. Behind the marble facades of Athens and the oak groves of Gaul, secrets thrived not just as whispers but as instruments of order. The Illusinian mysteries weren't merely spiritual retreats, they were the glue binding Greece's fractious elites. For over 1,000 years, politicians, poets, and generals alike made the pilgrimage to Eleusis, where priests guided them through nights of hallucinogenic brews and shadowed pageantry. What exactly transpired remains shrouded, but the effect was undeniable. those who emerged swore an oath of silence so potent that even Plato, who hinted at the rites in his writings, never dared reveal their core. The genius of the system, it transformed rivals into brethren. After sharing an experience so profound it defied words, Athenian and Spartan, merchant and aristocrat, returned to their daily lives with an unspoken pact. Some truths were too sacred to weaponize. Meanwhile, in the misty highlands of Celtic Europe, Druids wielded knowledge as both scalpel and scepter. Their rituals conducted in hidden clearings, far from prying eyes, weren't just ceremonies. They were the legal and educational backbone of tribal societies. A dispute over land, only a druid could recite the ancestral precedents buried in oral tradition. A king seeking legitimacy, his coronation required their blessing, a ritual thick with omens and sacrifices. But here's what set them apart: their monopoly on literacy. While the masses relied on memory, Druids guarded their wisdom in coded verse, ensuring no challenge to their authority could take root. When Rome finally crushed their strongholds, it wasn't just out of conquest, it was because emperors understood that to control a people, you first had to dismantle their keepers of meaning. Yet labeling these groups as mere manipulators misses the nuance. In an era without textbooks or courts, secret societies functioned as living libraries and social stabilizers. The Vestal Virgins of Rome, for instance, didn't just tend the sacred flame. Their presence could halt battles. Armies would sheath their swords at the sight of these women, not out of fear, but because their purity symbolized a covenant even war couldn't breach. Similarly, in Egypt, the priesthoods' mastery of astronomy and flood prediction made them indispensable. Their secrets weren't just power plays, they were survival tools wrapped in ritual to ensure only the worthy could wield them. The darker truth, though, lies in what happened when these systems fractured. When the cult of Mithras, once the hidden backbone of Roman legions, faded in the face of Christianity, it wasn't just a religion that vanished. A network of loyalty and codes that had held armies together dissolved, leaving a void no emperor could easily fill. Likewise, the decline of Maya shamans, keepers of celestial calendars and rain rituals, coincided with cities abandoned to the jungle. Without their intermediaries, the pact between heaven and earth seemed broken, and faith in the old ways crumbled. Today, we see echoes of this dance between secrecy and control in everything from fraternal orders to algorithmic elites. The mediums have changed, but the pattern holds. Societies rely on gatekeepers of knowledge, whether they wear robes or hoodies. The ancient world simply understood something we often forget. That mystery, when carefully curated, isn't just about exclusion. It's about giving people a story sturdy enough to hold their trust, even when the world outside makes no sense at all. When drought-withered crops or invaders breached the gates, ancient rulers didn't just pray, they paid. Not with gold or grain, but with the one currency the gods seemed to demand, life itself. In Carthage, when the Greek general Agathocles besieged their city, the nobility didn't just rally troops. They led their own children into the fiery embrace of Baal Hammon, believing only the most precious sacrifice could turn the tide of war. To modern eyes, it's unthinkable. But in that moment, it wasn't cruelty, it was calculus. The logic was chillingly simple. When the world teetered on collapse, only an offering of equal weight could restore equilibrium. The Aztecs took this further, elevating sacrifice to cosmic bookkeeping. Their priests didn't just remove hearts to appease the gods, they were keeping the sun alive. Every sunrise required nourishment, and human blood was the price. During the Great Famine of 1454, when crops failed for years, the temples ran day and night, their steps slick with blood. To the Aztecs, this wasn't murder. It was maintenance, the same way we might frantically refuel a generator during a blackout. They saw each heart as a log thrown onto the celestial fire, buying another day before the world plunged into eternal darkness. But here's what's often misunderstood. These weren't acts of blind desperation. They were meticulously regulated systems of exchange. In Mesopotamia, the substitute king ritual saw a criminal or beggar crowned ruler during eclipses, omens predicting the king's death. After days of royal treatment, the substitute would be executed, his death absorbing the disaster meant for the true monarch. Morbid, absolutely, but for societies that saw disaster as divine accounting errors, it was a way to balance the books without losing the one person holding the kingdom together. The terrifying genius of these rituals lay in their feedback loop. When Carthage survived Agathocle's siege, it wasn't seen as military strategy, it was proof the sacrifices worked. When the sun rose after an Aztec blood rite, it confirmed their grim arithmetic. Success reinforced the system, making each crisis harder to question. Even failures could be explained away. Perhaps the offering wasn't pure enough or the ceremony flawed. The system was unfalsifiable, a self-sealing logic that turned sacrifice from an option into an obligation. Yet buried beneath the brutality was a raw human truth. In chaos, people crave control. When volcanoes darkened the sky or plague emptied cities, sacrifice offered something more vital than divine favor. It gave agency. A farmer watching his fields wither could either succumb to helplessness or believe his village offerings might sway the rains. The very act of giving something up, however horrific, transformed passive victims into active participants in their own survival. Today, we've swapped altars for algorithms, but the psychology lingers. When markets crash or pandemics strike, we don't burn children. We burn capital, jobs, or personal freedoms, believing these modern sacrifices will restore balance. The language has changed, but the impulse remains. When the world fractures, we still seek something precious enough to trade for order. The difference is, we no longer call it ritual. We call it crisis management. Dreams weren't private affairs in the ancient world. They were state secrets. When an Assyrian king lay down to rest, his slumber wasn't just personal, it was political. Royal dream priests stood ready to dissect every symbol, every shadow that flickered through the ruler's mind. A serpent coiling in the darkness that might signal betrayal. A flood swallowing the palace, the gods could be warning of invasion. These interpretations weren't mere speculation. They were the foundation of foreign policy, military strategy, even tax reforms. One recorded instance tells of a Mesopotamian king who abandoned a planned attack after dreaming of his chariot sinking into mud, a vision his priests declared an omen of defeat. The battle never happened. History pivoted on a nightmare. Egypt took this further, turning dreams into a sacred science. Beneath the temples of Serapis, narrow stone chambers housed petitioners who slept on special dream beds, waiting for the gods to speak. But this wasn't open to everyone. Access required purification rituals, offerings, and the approval of priests who acted as gatekeepers to the divine. When a pharaoh like Thutmose IV dreamed of the Sphinx promising him the throne if he cleared the sand from its paws, the story wasn't just propaganda. It was legal justification, a celestial endorsement etched onto steels for all to see. Dreams didn't just influence power, they legitimized it, yet the most fascinating cases come from the edges of empire. The Greek colony of Syracuse once faced a naval disaster until its general, Hermocrates, dreamed of Athena whispering a battle strategy. He rearranged his ships at dawn and won. Was it divine intervention, strategic intuition dressed in myth? What matters is that the story spread, reinforcing the idea that leaders didn't just make decisions. They channeled them from something beyond human reason, but dreams had a darker side. When the Babylonian king Nabonidus shared visions of his gods abandoning him, his priests panicked. Those dreams didn't just predict doom, they accelerated it. The king's own subconscious became a weapon in the hands of rivals who cited his disturbed nights as proof the gods had withdrawn their favor. Within months, Persia's Cyrus the Great marched into Babylon unopposed. The lesson was clear. In a world where dreams were diplomacy, a restless mind could topple a dynasty. Today, we dismiss dreams as random neuron firings, but ancient rulers understood their visceral power. A vision could rally armies or dissolve alliances because people believed in the unseen logic behind them. Modern leaders might not consult dream priests, but think of how often we still frame decisions as gut feelings or calling it in. The language has changed, but the allure remains. To believe our biggest choices aren't just ours, but whispers from something older, wiser, moving beneath the surface of things. Dance wasn't just entertainment in the ancient world. It was a living, breathing archive. When Persian Sufis spun in their white robes, they weren't just performing. Their whirling was a map of the cosmos, each rotation mirroring planets in orbit, each step a prayer etched into the ground. To watch them was to witness a sacred geometry, a way of encoding spiritual truths into muscle memory so deep that even conquest couldn't scrub it away. And that's precisely why invaders feared these movements. When the Mongols swept through Anatolia, they banned the dervishes' rituals first, understanding that to silence their dance was to dismantle a world woven into every turn and tilt. Now, journey to Japan, where Kagura dancers donned masks carved from cypress wood, transforming into gods before the villagers' eyes. These weren't mere performances, they were reenactments of the moment the sun goddess Amaterasu emerged from her cave, ending the world's darkness. Every gesture, from the flick of a fan to the stamp of a foot, was a thread connecting the present to the mythic past. When Christian missionaries in the 16th century demanded these dances cease, they didn't just encounter resistance, they sparked rebellions. Because to strip a community of its dance was to sever its lifeline to history itself. But nowhere was the defiance of ritual movement more visceral than in Crete. Bull leaping wasn't a sport or a spectacle, it was a coded language of survival. Young men and women vaulted over charging bulls not to prove bravery, but to rehearse a timeless truth. Chaos could be met head-on, even danced with. The bull represented earthquakes, tsunamis, all the uncontrollable forces that plagued their island. By leaping over its back again and again, they were asserting something radical. That disaster could be transformed into rhythm, that fear could be choreographed into grace. This pattern repeats across continents. When Spanish colonizers banned the Danza de los Voladores in Mesoamerica, where men spiraled down ropes from towering poles, mimicking sacred birds, the rituals simply retreated into the mountains, practiced in secret for generations. The same happened with the hula in Hawaii, outlawed by missionaries who saw its hip movements as indecent. What they failed to grasp was that every sway told stories of creation, every chant preserved genealogies. To ban the dance wasn't just censorship, it was cultural amnesia, and that's the untold power of these movements. They weren't just expressions of identity, they were its guardians. In West Africa, griots didn't just recite history, they danced it, their feet tracing migration routes and battle formations across the dust. In Aboriginal Australia, song lines weren't sung but walked, each step retelling the journeys of ancestral beings. To erase these dances was to unspool the very fabric of time, leaving people untethered in a world that no longer remembered their names. So the next time you tap your foot to a folk song or lose yourself in a festival crowd, remember, you're part of an unbroken chain. Those rhythms survived not despite persecution, but because they carried something too vital to silence, the map of who we are, written not in ink, but in motion. The breath of the gods smelled of sulfur and laurel leaves at Delphi, where kings and generals knelt before a woman who spoke in tongues. Pythia, perched on her tripod above the sacred fissure, didn't just utter prophecies, she weaponized ambiguity. When Croesus of Lydia asked whether to invade Persia, her reply was perfect. If you cross the river, a great empire will fall. He did, and it was his own. The genius of the oracle lay in its phrasing. Like a diplomatic cable written by poets, every answer could bend to fit reality's twists. Across the Aegean, Sparta's leaders knew better than to march without consulting the bones. Before declaring war, they'd drag a herd of goats to Artemis's altar, watching for omens in the way the animals shuddered as the blade fell. A clean kill meant approval, a struggle spelled disaster. But here's what modern historians often miss. These rituals weren't just about seeking permission. They were about distributing responsibility. When an entire city-state gambled its fate on battle, the rulers needed more than strategy. They needed alibis etched in divine ink. Now shift east to the Shang dynasty, where emperors didn't trust human intermediaries at all. They went straight to the source, turtle shells and ox bones scorched until they cracked like dry riverbeds. Priests would then read the fractures as celestial commentary, interpreting the zigzag lines as approval or veto for everything from tax reforms to military campaigns. The system was shockingly bureaucratic. Archaeologists have found over 200,000 inscribed bones, some bearing follow-up notes like, divined on day 7, the harvest will prosper, followed later by, it did. These weren't just prayers, they were divine contracts meticulously filed. The real power of these oracles lay in their flexibility. When Athenian diplomats faced Persian envoys, both sides could claim their oracle backed their position because the prophecies were designed to accommodate either outcome. This wasn't deception, it was early game theory. By making divine will just obscure enough to require interpretation, these rituals created space for compromise. A ruler could back down from war without losing face by saying the gods had revealed new wisdom. Conversely, a questionable invasion could be framed as fulfilling some long-ago prophecy suddenly understood in a new light. But the darkest twist, some oracles weren't just ambiguous, they were rigged. Macedonian kings allegedly funneled gold to Delphi's priests to nudge prophecies in their favor. The Etruscans had a reputation for adjusting entrail readings to please wealthy patrons. Even the famed Sibylline books of Rome, consulted during existential crises, were kept under lock and key by a special priesthood, ensuring only approved interpretations reached the public. Yet for all their manipulation, these systems worked because they answered a primal need, to believe that chaos had patterns. When plague struck or enemies massed at the gates, people didn't just want orders, they wanted stories where their suffering had meaning. A bad harvest became the gods testing our resolve. A lost battle transformed into part of a larger plan. The oracles didn't just predict the future. They made it survivable. Today's leaders might not burn turtle shells, but watch how often they invoke unavoidable forces or historic inevitability to justify decisions. The language has secularized, but the instinct remains to cloak human choices in the mantle of something greater, something beyond question. The next time you hear a politician speak of destiny or divine providence, listen closely. You might just catch the echo of Pythia's laughter, still shaping empires from a tripod throne. When pestilence stalked the streets of Babylon, priests didn't reach for herbs or potions, they reached for brooms. Their cure for plague wasn't medical, it was theatrical. Every morning, they'd parade through the city with statues of the healing goddess Gula, sweeping the air as if brushing disease into the idol's porous clay. At dusk, these effigies would be dunked in the river, carrying the contagion downstream. To modern eyes, it seems absurd, but in a world where sickness felt like divine punishment, this ritual wasn't just ceremony, it was crisis management. The statues became psychological sponges, absorbing not just germs but fear itself. Meanwhile, along the Ganges, Hindu pilgrims still perform variations of an ancient prescription: immersion in sacred waters to cleanse both body and soul. Science confirms the river's bacterial load would horrify any epidemiologist, yet the ritual persists not because it kills pathogens, but because it kills despair. During cholera outbreaks in the 1800s, British colonizers noted with frustration that bans on ritual bathing failed. What they didn't grasp was that for devotees, the alternative, staying home, waiting helplessly, felt more dangerous than any microbe. The brilliance of these rites lay in their dual function. In Egypt, priests treating eye infections would recite spells while applying ointments of honey and copper salts, one addressing the invisible cause, angry gods, the other the visible symptoms, bacterial growth. Neither worked perfectly alone, but together they covered all bases. When the Roman plague of 165 raged, Galen recorded how temples burned aromatic resins day and night. We now know some resins have mild antiseptic properties, but their real power was olfactory. That constant smolder of frankincense did more than purify air. It purified minds, offering a sensory signal that protection was active. Yet the most haunting examples come from times of collective trauma. During the Black Death, European flagellants marched through towns whipping themselves bloody, believing pain could atone for whatever cosmic imbalance brought the pestilence. Their torn skin became a metaphor for a ruptured world, their suffering a performance of penitence meant to reset the natural order, gruesome, undoubtedly. But in the absence of germ theory, their logic held a terrible symmetry. If disease was divine wrath, then ritual suffering might be the only currency heaven accepted. What these ancient practices understood, and what modern medicine sometimes forgets, is that healing requires more than chemistry. When Ebola ravaged West Africa in 2014, health workers battling the outbreak hit an unexpected wall. Survivors were often shunned. Then anthropologists made a crucial discovery. Communities weren't rejecting science, they needed rituals to mark the transition from contaminated to clean. So workers adapted, incorporating local purification ceremonies into discharge protocols. The result, acceptance rates soared. This isn't just history repeating itself. It's proof that the line between spiritual and scientific healing was always blurrier than we admit. Those Babylonian statues didn't cure plague, but they gave terrified citizens something to do besides panic. The Ganges waters may not sterilize, but they offer a tangible act of renewal when medicine has no answers. Because the deepest human truth isn't that we need cures, it's that we need narratives to endure the wait for them. A crown might glitter with gold, but without the sacred oil, the sacred rice, the sacred words, it was just metal. Ancient rulers understood that authority wasn't handed down, it was conjured, step by ritual step, in full view of the people. Take Saul's anointing. When the prophet Samuel poured oil over his head, it wasn't just a blessing. It was a metaphysical contract, a public signal that this man now carried divine weight. The oil itself was secondary. What mattered was the spectacle, the moment when a mere soldier became something more, something untouchable. Now, fast forward 3,000 years to Japan's Daijusai, where an emperor still disappears into a thatched hut to share a meal with the sun goddess Amaterasu. The rice he eats isn't just food, it's a transfusion of divinity. Every grain, every chew is a silent revolution, transforming a mortal into a living god before the eyes of his subjects. Skip this ritual and the imperial line crumbles, because the throne isn't inherited, it's renewed, bite by sacred bite. But here's what's fascinating. These ceremonies weren't just about the ruler. They were about the ruled. When English monarchs were anointed with chrism, a mix of oil and balsam so holy it was said to have been brought by angels, the scent alone was propaganda. The fragrance clung to their skin for weeks, a walking reminder that this wasn't just a person, this was a scent-marked sovereign chosen by heaven, and that aroma. It was democracy-proof. No rebel could argue with the smell of sanctity. The sheer stagecraft of these rituals reveals their true purpose. In medieval France, kings didn't just wear the crown, they healed scrofula, the king's evil, with a touch. The miracle wasn't medical, it was political theater. By curing the sick, they proved their legitimacy in the most visceral way possible, through flesh and faith. Failed to perform, and whispers of usurpation began. Yet the most brutal truth lies in what happened when rituals were skipped. When Henry IV seized England's throne but rushed his coronation, nobles revolted within months. Why? Because power without pageantry was just theft. The same pattern repeats across continents, from the Maya, whose rulers reenacted the god-king's resurrection at each coronation, to the Zulu kings who had to undergo the Eye Nkatha, a ritual binding them to the land's very soil. Skip the steps, and the kingdom saw not a leader, but a pretender playing dress-up. Today, we've swapped holy oil for constitutional oaths, but the principle remains. Watch any modern leader take office: the raised hand, the sacred text, the solemn vow. The props have changed, but the performance hasn't, because deep down we still believe what the ancients knew: legitimacy isn't taken. It's staged. The pyramids of Giza didn't just house the dead. They were cosmic engines humming with rituals designed to propel pharaohs into the afterlife as living gods. Every corridor, every hidden chamber, every ounce of gold placed in those tombs served a single purpose: to reactivate the ruler's authority in the realm of the divine. The opening of the mouth ceremony, performed by priests with ceremonial blades, wasn't symbolic, it was functional. By touching the statue of the deceased pharaoh, they believed they could literally restore his senses, enabling him to eat, speak, and rule beyond death. This wasn't mere superstition. It was a national security strategy, because if the pharaoh's spirit faltered, so would the Nile's floods, the harvests, the very order of the universe. Half a world away, Chinese emperors took a different but equally pragmatic approach. Their ancestors weren't just remembered, they were consulted. Oracle bones from the Shang dynasty reveal a bureaucracy of the dead, where rulers asked departed forebears for guidance on war, weather, and taxes. The dead weren't passive relics, they were active cabinet members, their wisdom channeled through crackling turtle shells and smoking bronze vessels. Neglect them, and the consequences were immediate. Records from the Zhou dynasty tell of droughts and rebellions blamed on skipped ancestral rites, as if the nation's wiring had short-circuited. The Aztecs pushed this logic to its most visceral extreme. When a ruler died, his successor didn't just inherit a throne, he inherited a corpse. The dead king's skin was flayed, and a priest would wear it for days, dancing in temples and markets. Macabre, absolutely, but the symbolism was airtight. The old ruler's power wasn't gone. It had been transferred, like a mantle woven from flesh, to bystanders. The message was unmistakable: authority didn't die. It simply changed hands, yet the most telling examples come from societies that broke the ritual chain. When the Hittite Empire collapsed, archaeologists found royal tombs looted not by invaders, but by their own descendants. Facing famine and invasion, later rulers had dug up their ancestors' treasures to pay for armies, a desperate move that backfired spectacularly. Chroniclers of the time described the resulting chaos as divine retribution, the natural consequence of violating the dead's peace. Similarly, when the Maya city of Capon neglected its ancestor rites, stele records show a sudden rash of bad kings, rulers whose reigns were marked by drought and revolt. Coincidence or proof that when you sever the thread to the past, the future unravels? Today, we've swapped mummification for memorials, but the instinct remains. Watch how nations guard their war memorials, how politicians invoke founding fathers, how cultures cling to graveside traditions. The rituals have softened, but the contract endures. Honor those who came before, or risk losing the right to those who will come after. Because the dead never really leave, they just wait silently for their share of the bargain to be upheld. Rome's Saturnalia wasn't just a festival, it was societal alchemy. For 7 days each December, the unthinkable became law. Slaves dined on couches while their masters served them wine. Insults flowed without punishment, and gambling spilled into the streets. On the surface, it looked like pure revelry, but beneath the drunken laughter lay a razor-sharp design. By inverting the social order for a fleeting moment, Rome's elites weren't just entertaining the masses, they were disarming them. The genius of Saturnalia was its expiration date. Like a pressure valve on a boiling pot, the festival let steam escape in controlled bursts, ensuring the lid never blew off entirely. Now shift east to Persia's Nowruz, where the spring equinox didn't just mark a new year. It rewrote the rules of human connection. For 13 days, debts were forgiven, enemies embraced, and the poorest families received gifts from the wealthiest. The ritual wasn't about charity, it was about resetting the social ledger. When neighbors who'd feuded all year shared a plate of sabzi polo mahai, the act wasn't symbolic, it was contractual. The meal became a living treaty, its flavors binding participants to a fresh start. These festivals shared a dark brilliance. They weaponized chaos to preserve order. In medieval Europe, the Feast of Fools let peasants crown a Lord of Misrule who parodied the clergy with bawdy sermons. The church tolerated even sponsored these spectacles because they channeled dissent into ritual. Let people laugh at authority for a day, and they'd obey it the rest of the year. Similarly, Japan's Aoi Matsuri featured nobles dressed as commoners stumbling through Kyoto, their exaggerated drunkenness a safety valve for class tensions. But the most striking examples come from societies that skipped this ritual calculus. When the Spanish suppressed indigenous festivals in the Andes, events where villagers once mocked their Inca overlords, they didn't just erase tradition. They erased a coping mechanism. Within decades, pent-up frustrations exploded in revolts far bloodier than any ritualized mockery. The same pattern unfolded in 19th century Haiti, where colonial bans on Vodou dances didn't stifle resistance, they radicalized it, transforming spiritual gatherings into war councils. These ancient festivals understood something modern societies often forget. Rebellion isn't the enemy of order, it's its shadow partner. By carving out sacred spaces for misrule, civilizations didn't just tolerate dissent, they domesticated it. The laughter around a Saturnalia table, the spilled wine during Nowruz, the grotesque masks of carnival, all were rehearsals for revolution that never had to happen. Because sometimes the best way to keep a society intact is to let it play at falling apart. The clash of swords wasn't always the prelude to slaughter, sometimes it was the alternative. Long before David faced Goliath on that dusty battlefield, civilizations had perfected the art of ritual combat, turning war into something almost surgical. Picture two champions stepping forward, their armor glinting under the watchful eyes of priests, their duel blessed as a sacred trial. The stakes, not just personal glory, but the fate of nations. The logic was brutally elegant. Let one life stand in for thousands and spare the fields from being watered with blood. This wasn't just warfare, it was diplomacy by blade. Take the Viking holmgang, a duel so codified it might as well have been a courtroom with swords. Disputes over land, honor, even inheritances could be settled on a square of hide staked to the ground. The rules were strict: step outside the boundary and you forfeited, lose your weapon and the fight paused while you retrieved it. This wasn't chaos. It was conflict distilled to its essence, a way to prevent feuds from spiraling into generational vendettas. The irony: these barbarians had a more orderly system for resolving disputes than many modern legal codes. But ritual combat wasn't just a European obsession. In Mesoamerica, the Maya staged ceremonial ball games where teams fought not just for victory, but for divine favor. The losing captain might lose his head, a grim price, but one that satisfied the gods and averted wider war. Across the Pacific, Japanese samurai adhered to Bushido's strict dueling etiquette, where a single stroke of the katana could settle grievances without dragging entire clans into chaos. So why did these systems fade? The answer lies in the cold math of empire. As armies grew from hundreds to thousands, the idea of a single duel deciding a battle became absurd. When Rome fielded legions or China mobilized its terracotta hordes, symbolism gave way to sheer scale. A champion's death might still inspire, but it couldn't stop 10,000 spears. Yet even then, echoes lingered. Medieval knights jousting in tournaments weren't just showing off. They were keeping alive the old idea that conflict could be contained, codified, even civilized. The real tragedy: we lost more than spectacle when ritual combat vanished. We lost a way to resolve disputes without burning villages. Today's world, with its drone strikes and proxy wars, might do well to remember that sometimes the most brutal solutions are also the most merciful. Silence could be louder than any war cry in the ancient world. While most imagine rituals as chants and drumbeats, some of history's most powerful ceremonies unfolded in absolute stillness. Take Rome's Vestal Virgins. Their 30-year vow of silence wasn't just a personal sacrifice. It was the city's lifeline. The sacred flame they guarded symbolized Rome's pact with the gods, and their silence was the glue holding that pact together. A single whispered word from them could, according to legend, unravel the empire's fortune. Their quiet wasn't passive, it was a roaring declaration of discipline, a force strong enough to bend the divine will. Journey to the Himalayas and you'd find silence weaponized in an entirely different way. Tibetan monks would retreat into pitch-black caves for years, their only companions the echoes of their own breath. This wasn't escapism, it was spiritual alchemy. By stripping away all distraction, they believed they could distill wisdom to its purest form. Some emerged with insights that reshaped entire schools of Buddhism, their years of isolation yielding philosophies that still guide millions today. Their silence wasn't empty, it was a forge where enlightenment was hammered into being. Even in the political realm, silence held surprising power. The Quakers, though much later in history, built their entire faith around the potency of shared quiet. Their meetings had no priests, no sermons, just collective stillness until someone felt moved by the divine to speak. From this radical practice came some of the earliest abolitionist movements and women's rights campaigns. Their revolutions weren't shouted from pulpits, they grew in the fertile soil of deliberate quiet. What these traditions understood, and what we often forget, is that silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of something deeper. When the Oracle of Delphi fell silent for 9 days each year, it wasn't a malfunction. It was a reset, a sacred pause that made her prophecies potent upon her return. The Maori of New Zealand began important meetings with extended silence, believing it cleared the space of deceit. Even nature seems to agree. Studies now show that forests grow more resilient when periods of quiet follow storms. Today, we treat silence like a void to be filled, but history whispers a different truth, that the most transformative forces often work in stillness. The next time you feel the urge to fill a quiet moment, remember you might be interrupting a revolution. A golden cup passed between enemies could do what armies could not, turn sworn foes into blood brothers. In ancient Sumer, the clinking of beer mugs wasn't just celebration, it was contract law in liquid form. When city-states clashed over water rights or trade routes, diplomats didn't exchange scrolls, they shared a vat of fermented barley. The act of drinking together transformed the treaty from ink on clay to a sacred bond, sealed not just by words but by the warmth of alcohol coursing through shared veins. Refuse the brew, and you weren't just being rude, you were declaring war. Half a continent away, Mongol Khans took this logic to the steppes. Before battle, rival leaders would sit in a yurt, passing a bowl of arag, fermented mare's milk that tasted like victory or surrender, depending on who held the cup. The drink itself was almost beside the point. What mattered was the ritual, the way your lips touched the same rim as your enemies, the way your throat swallowed the same bitter draught. By the time the bowl was empty, the terms were set, no scribe needed. The real treaty wasn't written on parchment, it was written on the body, but the true masters of edible diplomacy were the Hawaiians. When chiefs wanted peace, they didn't send envoys, they sent pigs. Not just any pigs, but ones fattened on sacred sweet potatoes, roasted in underground ovens until the meat fell from the bone. To eat together from the same imu was to absorb each other's mana, the spiritual force that governed power. The meal wasn't a prelude to negotiation, it was the negotiation. Every bite carried terms, every chew an unspoken clause. What made these rituals so effective was their irreversibility. Unlike a signed document that could be burned or hidden, a shared feast left witnesses, and digestion was a one-way process. When Aztec nobles sealed an alliance, they didn't just shake hands, they exchanged tamales stuffed with rare chilies and gold dust, ensuring the pact couldn't be undone without literal indigestion. The Maya took it further, pressing royal fingerprints into chocolate foam as edible signatures. Break the promise, and you weren't just dishonorable, you were digestively blasphemous. Today's leaders might raise glasses at state dinners, but the stakes are lower. No modern diplomat fears that refusing a toast will trigger invasion. Yet the shadow of these rituals lingers in every business lunch, every shared coffee that smooths a deal. Because deep down, we still believe what the ancients knew: trust isn't built in boardrooms. It's brewed in cups, baked in ovens, and served on plates, one deliberate bite at a time. A mask wasn't just a disguise, it was a hall pass for truth. In the sacred groves of ancient Greece, actors strapping on the exaggerated faces of gods and heroes weren't just performing, they were hacking the system. Thespes, the legendary first actor, didn't just step onto that wooden stage to entertain. He stepped into a loophole. By wearing the mask of Dionysus, he could say what no citizen dared whisper in the agora. The moment the clay and linen pressed against his skin, he wasn't Thespes anymore. He was a vessel for divine mockery, skewering corrupt politicians and petty tyrants to roaring applause. The genius of this ritual, the audience could laugh at the joke while the ruler could pretend it wasn't about him. Theater wasn't just art. It was social surgery with plausible deniability. Across the ocean, Aztec comedians took this further. Their carved wooden masks transformed them into sacred fools, licensed to lampoon emperors mid-ceremony. Imagine the scene: a masked jester mimicking the king's pompous gait during the new fire festival, the crowd gasping before erupting in laughter. No execution order followed. Why? Because the mask wasn't just hiding the performer, it was honoring tradition. The ritual demanded satire as part of the cosmic balance. For one fleeting moment, hierarchy flipped and power had to swallow its pride. But the real stroke of brilliance lay in the design. Greek theater masks had megaphone-shaped mouths, amplifying whispers into declarations. Aztec jesters' masks often bore the features of trickster gods, framing insults as divine service. Even the materials carried meaning. The Greek masks were painted with lead-based pigments that literally made them heavier, a physical reminder that speaking truth required bearing weight. This dance between disguise and disclosure shaped more than just entertainment. In medieval Japan, no theater's wooden masks let actors embody ancestral spirits who could critique shogunate policies without reprisal. In West Africa, geled masquerades turned dancers into incarnations of maternal elders, using humor to scold wayward leaders under the guise of ritual. The pattern repeats wherever autocracy and ingenuity collide. Give people a ceremonial veil, and they'll use it to lift the veil on power. What these traditions understood, and what modern protests often forget, is that ridicule thrives best when wrapped in reverence. A tweet can be deleted, a pamphlet burned, but a mask sanctified by tradition, that's harder to silence. The laughter it provokes isn't just mockery, it's a diagnostic tool, exposing the weak spots in a leader's armor without drawing blood. So the next time you see a satirical news segment or a political cartoon, remember, you're witnessing the echo of a far older practice. The masks may have evolved into avatars and memes, but the game remains the same. Truth wears a costume, and power must endure the performance, or risk revealing it has no clothes. The ticking of your clock isn't just counting seconds, it's echoing the chants of Babylonian priests who first sliced time into sacred portions. While we obsess over productivity hacks and time management, the very scaffolding of our schedules was forged in temple courtyards, not boardrooms. Take the humble hour divided into 60 minutes. Practical hardly. The Babylonians worshipped a pantheon of 60 gods, and their base 60 number system wasn't chosen for efficiency, it was a celestial homage. Every time you check your watch, you're glancing at a devotional act frozen in mathematics. Now, shift your gaze to the jungles of Yucatan, where Mayan astronomers didn't just track Venus, they weaponized its orbit. Their codices reveal wars timed to the planet's appearances, battles scheduled like divine appointments. When Venus emerged as the morning star, it wasn't just an astronomical event, it was a signal to march. The logic was flawless. Why gamble on human strategy when you could synchronize attacks with cosmic rhythms? Their victories weren't just won on battlefields, but in observatories where priest astronomers calculated celestial windows for maximum advantage. Even the calendar hanging on your wall hides a ritual intervention. When Pope Gregory XIII trimmed 10 days from the year in 1582, he wasn't just fixing a math error. He was realigning Easter with the spring equinox, preserving the church's most sacred festival from drifting into summer. Farmers may have grumbled at the lost harvest days, but the church understood: control time, and you control the rhythm of faith itself. The Gregorian calendar wasn't adopted because it was accurate, it was adopted because it was orthodox. What's startling is how these spiritual timekeeping systems birthed modern efficiency. The Babylonian 60-part hour eventually proved perfect for angular measurements in navigation and engineering. Mayan Venus tables, though designed for war, became some of the most precise astronomical records of the ancient world. Even Gregory's calendar reform inadvertently standardized global commerce. The lesson: ritual doesn't just shape belief, it builds infrastructure. Today, we've swapped star charts for scheduling apps, but the pattern holds. Silicon Valley's latest productivity cults, from Pomodoro timers to circadian rhythm hacking, are just secular versions of the old rites. We still treat time as something to be harnessed, segmented, and optimized, only now we worship at the altar of output instead of the gods. The irony, our obsession with efficiency might be the one ritual we've forgotten is a ritual. A clenched hand on a sacred text isn't just a gesture, it's the ghost of an ancient pact, one where breaking your word meant risking more than a lawsuit. Long before courtrooms had stenographers, they had specters of divine retribution. In Vedic India, witnesses didn't just swear to tell the truth, they drank truth water, infused with herbs believed to induce convulsions if they lied. The trial wasn't held in a jury's hands, but in the defendant's gut. Across the Aegean, Greek litigants took oaths while standing on the sliced flesh of sacrificial boars, a visceral reminder that perjury would leave them spiritually dismembered. These weren't legal formalities, they were psychological tripwires wired to the fear of something far worse than jail. The brilliance of these rituals lay in their theater. When a medieval knight swore fealty on a relic, a saint's bone, or a splinter of the true cross, he wasn't just promising loyalty. He was starring in a cosmic drama where the audience included every holy power in heaven. Break that oath and the consequences weren't just earthly. Your name would rot in celestial ledgers, your soul forfeit in the afterlife. Even kings trembled under that weight. Charlemagne's coronation oath included a clause invoking the punishment of the traitor Judas, a threat so vivid it needed no explanation. But the real innovation was how these rituals democratized justice. Norse lawmen conducted ting assemblies where oaths were sworn on a ring dipped in sacrificial blood, a grisly but egalitarian system. Rich or poor, your word carried the same divine collateral. In West Africa, the Akan people used suman oaths where swearers held stones believed to house vengeful spirits. Lie under that weight, and the spirits would hunt you through dreams. The message was clear. Truth wasn't just a civic duty, it was a survival skill. Today's courtroom Bibles and sworn affidavits might seem like secular holdovers, but the DNA remains. When a witness raises their right hand, they're channeling a lineage that stretches back to temples, not tribunals. The stakes have shifted from damnation to perjury charges, but the ritual still serves its ancient purpose, to make words heavier than air, to bind promise to consequence. Because deep down, we still crave that old alchemy, the moment when language stops being just sound and starts being steel. The lyre's strings didn't just play melodies, they pulled soldiers into formation like invisible reins. When Trojan warriors marched toward battle, their steps didn't follow a general's shout but the measured pluck of strings, each note a silent command woven into the air. This wasn't background music, it was a weapon disguised as art, synchronizing hundreds of hearts and feet into a single, unstoppable rhythm. The Greeks knew this too well. Their paeans weren't just hymns to Apollo but sonic armor, thickening morale before the first spear flew. Lose the rhythm, and you didn't just lose coordination. You lost the trance that made men charge into certain death without hesitation. Now, cross the Atlantic to the jungles where Aztec drummers pounded hides stretched tight over human skulls, their beats mirroring the terrified pulse of enemies. The deeper psychology was chilling. Those rhythms didn't just motivate their own warriors, they hijacked the nervous systems of opponents. When the Teponaztli drums thundered at dawn, the sound wasn't heard. It was felt in the ribs, in the teeth, a visceral reminder that resistance was as futile as trying to outrun your own heartbeat. The drummers weren't musicians. They were siege engineers, dismantling enemy resolve one vibration at a time. But the most sophisticated use of martial music came from the steppes. Mongol horsemen didn't carry drums, they became them. Every rider's saddle had iron rattles that clattered in unison at full gallop, transforming 10,000 horses into a single, deafening instrument. To opposing armies, the sound wasn't just noise, it was mathematical terror, an audible demonstration of perfect coordination at scale. The message was clear: if they could move this precisely in chaos, how could they possibly be stopped? What made these sonic strategies so potent was their dual effect. For allies, the rhythms triggered dopamine and adrenaline cocktails, easing fear and amplifying focus. For enemies, the same sounds induced a fight-or-flight response without a single arrow being loosed. The Roman cornu, a curved bronze horn that could project for miles, didn't just relay orders. Its mournful wail chemically drained opponents' courage while flooding Roman legionaries with aggression. This wasn't primitive warfare, it was neuroscience avant la lettre. Today, we've swapped lyres for rally cries and drumbeats for fighter jet flyovers, but the principle remains. Music still bends minds before bullets fly. Just ask any soldier whose spine stiffens at the first bars of their national anthem. The instruments have changed, but the ancient truth endures. Win the soundscape, and you've already half won the war. A ruler's bath wasn't just about hygiene, it was about washing away an entire kingdom's guilt. In ancient Japan's Ohari festival, priests would weave straw dolls called hitagata, breathing into them the sins of the people before setting them adrift on rivers leading to the sea. This wasn't symbolic theater, it was societal detox, a way to externalize blame so the community could start fresh. The dolls weren't mere effigies, they were psychological lightning rods, absorbing the collective anxieties that might otherwise fracture loyalty to the throne. And the timing was deliberate. Held twice yearly, these purifications coincided with planting and harvest, ensuring the emotional slate was clean when the stakes were highest. But Japan wasn't alone in this grim accounting. The Hebrews' scapegoat ritual took a living animal, often a ram, loaded it with the people's transgressions through priestly incantations, then drove it into the wilderness to perish. The genius of this system, it transformed abstract guilt into something tangible, something that could literally be seen stumbling away into the horizon. And once it vanished, so did the weight of moral failure. The Athenians practiced a darker version, selecting a beggar or criminal during the Thargelia festival, feeding them at public expense before burning their possessions and exiling them beyond the city walls. This pharmakos wasn't just punished, they were sanctified, their suffering reframed as a civic service. What these rituals understood, and what modern psychology confirms, is that guilt festers when it has no outlet. By giving societies a ceremonial vessel for their collective failings, these traditions prevented internal rot. The Aztecs took this further, dressing slaves as gods during Toxcatl before sacrificing them, their deaths absorbing not just human sins but cosmic imbalances. The catharsis came from watching corruption incarnate being obliterated, leaving the world momentarily purified. The brilliance lay in the dual message. Leaders weren't above reproach, but neither were they solely responsible. When plague struck or crops failed, the fault wasn't pinned directly on the king. It was transferred to the scapegoat, preserving the ruler's authority while still providing emotional resolution. This delicate balance kept societies stable through crises that might otherwise have sparked revolts. Today's leaders still perform subtle versions of this ritual, resignations of cabinet members during scandals, public apologies choreographed for maximum symbolism. The language has secularized, but the pattern remains. Identify the vessel, load it with blame, and let its removal restore the illusion of purity. The only difference. Our scapegoats now wear suits instead of straw. A royal wedding ceremony wasn't just a celebration, it was a divine contract written in flesh and gold. When Cleopatra wed her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, the shared blood in their veins wasn't an accident of birth. It was political engineering, a ritual loop designed to keep Egypt's throne immune to outsiders. Their union, blessed by priests who anointed them as living incarnations of Isis and Osiris, transformed sibling marriage from taboo into sacrament. The message to the people was clear: this wasn't incest. It was alchemy, purifying power into something too sacred for common hands. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, queens arrived at their weddings like cryptographic puzzles, their bodies encoding treaties too fragile for parchment. When Elena of Aquitaine married Louis VII of France, she wasn't just a bride, she was a living land deed, her dowry stitching together territories larger than some kingdoms. The priests who officiated didn't merely bless the couple, they sanctified the geopolitical math, turning cold calculations into celestial bonds. Break this marriage, and you weren't just provoking a husband's wrath. You risked divine retribution for sundering what heaven had joined. The Aztecs took this logic to its most theatrical extreme. When a conquered city surrendered, the victor wouldn't just demand tribute, they'd demand a royal daughter. But this wasn't mere humiliation. The girl would be ceremonially wed to the conqueror's god, her body becoming a vessel to absorb the defeated people's identity into the empire's fabric. Resistance after that wasn't rebellion, it was sacrilege, yet the most cunning marriage rituals belonged to the Khmer Empire. Their kings didn't just marry foreign princesses, they married the spirits of the land itself. Before constructing Angkor Wat, Jayavarman II conducted a ritual where he wed a local mountain goddess through a human proxy. The ceremony wasn't metaphor. It was legal innovation, granting him rights to the territory not through force but through sacred matrimony, who could dispute a claim blessed by the very earth. These unions reveal a brutal truth. Love was the least useful ingredient in royal weddings. When Habsburg monarchs intermarried to preserve their bloodline, their infamous protruding jaws weren't just genetic quirks, they were ritual scars, the physical cost of turning marriage into a fortress. When Japanese emperors took multiple wives from competing clans, the bedroom became a diplomatic battleground, each pregnancy a potential shift in the balance of power. Today's white dresses and flower petals soften the calculus, but the old patterns linger. Watch how state weddings still choreograph every glance and gesture for cameras, how guest lists read like treaty negotiations. The language has changed, but the DNA remains. Beneath the veil of romance, marriage still builds empires. Rhythmic chanting wasn't just storytelling, it was the original cloud storage. Picture a Celtic druid standing in a moonlit grove, his voice weaving intricate legal codes into hypnotic verse, each syllable locked into place by meter and melody. This wasn't artistry, it was precision engineering for the mind, a system so reliable it could preserve 10,000 lines of law across generations without a single scrap of parchment. The secret: our brains are wired to remember patterns, not raw data. Turn a treaty into a song and suddenly it sticks like a burr to wool. The Iliad and Odyssey, those sprawling Greek epics, weren't composed with quills. They were sculpted by bards who could recite 30,000 words flawlessly, their memories trained like athletes through rhythmic repetition. Every epithet, every repeated phrase, rosy-fingered dawn, swift-footed Achilles, wasn't poetic filler. It was a mnemonic anchor, a foothold in the sheer cliff face of oral memory. Lose the rhythm, and the entire epic could unravel like a snapped thread. But the real masters were India's Vedic priests. Their scriptures were preserved with what scholars call patha, layered recitation techniques so rigorous they made memory fail-proof. One method involved chanting words backward. Another broke texts into puzzle pieces, recited out of order, then reassembled. The result: even if a single priest forgot, the collective memory would hold. After 1,200 years of oral transmission, when these hymns were finally written down, scribes found fewer errors than in modern photocopies. What's startling is how these techniques shaped societies. Ireland's Brehon laws, complex legal statutes governing everything from property to poetry, were preserved entirely in Druids' memories for centuries. No written copies existed until Christian monks arrived. The system worked because becoming a Druid wasn't like going to law school. It was a 20-year marathon of mental conditioning, where candidates would spend winters in darkness reciting until their voices gave out. Forget a single clause and the entire legal framework might collapse. The fragility of this system was its genius. Unlike clay tablets that could be smashed or scrolls that could burn, oral memory lived in human breath. But it demanded something we've lost: absolute attention. Modern experiments show that people remember only 10% of what they read, but 70% of what they recite rhythmically. The ancients didn't just know this, they built civilizations on it. Today, we've traded chanting for hard drives, but the ghost of these techniques lingers. From courtroom oaths recited verbatim to military cadences that synchronize platoons, we still use rhythm to cement what must not be forgotten: the difference. Our backups are digital. Theirs pulsed in the blood and bone of living, breathing librarians who carried entire worlds between their teeth. Rome's Lupercalia festival would make modern eyes widen grown men, stripped naked, sprinting through the streets with goat-hide whips, striking any woman who crossed their path. But this wasn't random violence, it was chaos by design, a ritual so outrageous it looped back into control. The whips made from sacrificed goats carried more than just symbolism. They were believed to transfer fertility with every lash, turning what looked like madness into sacred duty. Women bared their palms willingly, even eagerly, because the sting promised future children. The paradox was intentional. By carving out a space for frenzy within rigid Roman hierarchy, the state didn't weaken its grip, it strengthened it. But Lupercalia wasn't unique. Across the ancient world, societies engineered moments where the powerless could play at power, if only for a day. In Persia, the Sakia festival crowned a mock king, usually a condemned criminal, who ruled for 5 days of drunken revelry before being executed. The message was clear: authority was fragile, reversible, and ultimately a joke the gods allowed. Yet once the festival ended, the real king's rule felt divinely ordained by contrast. The Babylonians took this further with their Akitu festival, where the actual king was publicly humiliated, stripped of his regalia, and forced to kneel before the statue of Marduk. Only after confessing his failures could he be reinvested with power, his throne freshly legitimized by the spectacle of its temporary loss. The brilliance of these rituals lay in their dual nature. They weren't just pressure valves, they were mirrors. When Norse thralls were allowed to insult their masters during Yule celebrations, the jokes often revealed uncomfortable truths. A slave might mock his lord's stinginess or cowardice, and the laughter that followed wasn't just cathartic. It was corrective, a way for elites to course correct without formal rebuke. Similarly, Japan's Aoi Matsuri let peasants parody aristocrats in exaggerated processions, their over-the-top performances highlighting real grievances through the safety of ritual. But these festivals had teeth. The moment the license expired, so did tolerance. Roman law punished any whipping outside Lupercalia as assault. Persian mock kings who overstepped were executed early. The rules of rebellion were as strict as the rules of order because ultimately both served the same master. Controlled chaos didn't undermine the system. It inoculated it, letting societies vent steam without boiling over. Today's protests and carnivals still carry echoes of this ancient dance. From Mardi Gras beads to political satire, we flirt with disorder while counting on the clock to reset. The costumes change, but the calculus remains. Sometimes the best way to preserve a structure is to let it rattle, just never enough to collapse. From coronations to harvest dances, rituals were the unseen architects of civilizations. Think of them as society's operating system, invisible code running beneath the surface, turning random groups of people into nations, tribes into empires. They didn't just mark time, they manufactured meaning, transforming the chaotic raw material of human existence into something orderly and sacred. A king's crown was just metal until anointed with oil. A field was just dirt until blessed by chanting priests. These rituals were the glue that held the world together when logic and force fell short. Consider how we still measure time. Your calendar may be digital now, but its bones are ancient. The 7-day week, that's Babylon's homage to the 7 celestial gods, the names of the months. Roman rulers immortalized in syllables July for Julius, August for Augustus. Even something as mundane as shaking hands traces back to medieval knights, showing they carried no weapons. The past isn't dead. It's folded into our daily lives like a hidden seam in history's fabric. Yet the real power of these rituals wasn't in their pomp, it was in their adaptability. When Rome crumbled, the church didn't abolish pagan festivals, it rebranded them. Winter solstice became Christmas, spring fertility rites turned into Easter. The rituals stayed, but the stories changed, proving their resilience wasn't tied to any single belief. They were vessels capable of holding whatever meaning a culture needed to survive. And that's why they still matter. When a president takes an oath on a Bible or an athlete kisses their lucky charm before a game, they're not just following tradition, they're tapping into an old, deep magic. The kind that convinces a jury your word is binding, or a crowd that a crown isn't just jewelry. We've swapped animal sacrifices for stock market openings, but the underlying principle remains. Symbols only work if everyone agrees to believe in them together. So the next time you blow out birthday candles or stand for a national anthem, pause for a second. You're not just going through motions, you're whispering to ghosts. The ghosts of priests who turned kings into gods, of farmers who danced for rain, of warriors who bled for oaths. Their world may be gone, but their spells still linger, hidden in plain sight. And if you listen closely, you might just hear the ancient chant beneath the modern noise. This matters because we say it does. Want to keep unraveling history's hidden threads? Hit subscribe, we've only scratched the surface. The past has more secrets to share, and they're stranger than you think.